Hey Maria, welcome back to the GMAT Club YouTube channel. How have you been? Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. May 2022 not be the same dumpster fire that the past 2 years have been. I am cautiously optimistic.
Yeah, I was just on Twitter and somebody wrote that I didn't know 2020 was a trilogy, and so that was fantastic. But this is the last video of this mock application season. Just want to quickly recap for everyone who is just tuning in and hasn't seen the previous videos. So in the last four videos, we talked about how we can prep and create an application for about 4 to 5 business schools in a span of 2 weeks. So we talked through resumes, we talked through goals, we talked through how to develop your stories and how to write your goals meaningfully. In the last video, we actually wrote some essays. We wrote one goal essay, we wrote a short answer essay, and one leadership essay. So all of that is in the Google Doc in the description. But today I wanted to chat with you about the last two pieces of your application. The first one is the recommendation letters. For some schools, you have to write two of them. For some schools, you need to only get one. And then I want to talk through a bit of sanity checking, like what are some of the steps you need to take before you hit submit, right? I think this is especially valuable for people throwing in applications in a short period of time, right? Because the chances of making random mistakes is kind of higher because you're dealing with a lot in the span of 2 weeks. So let's start with recommendations first. So Maria, can you walk us through how schools view recommendations? Like, what are they really for?
Yeah, absolutely. So the recommendations are really, I think, primarily a way to keep applicants honest. And what I mean by that is that if there were no recommendations and if you did not have to submit any information of a boss or someone who at one point has managed you, I think certain people, not you and not GMAT club members, but certain people in the applicant pool might be tempted to exaggerate pretty extravagantly what their contributions have been. And so I think number one, and of course this is not what the schools will say, but for me, the recommendations help keep people honest, right? Knowing that they're going to have written stories from my recommender, someone who usually has managed me in the past, and that they can contact that recommender at any time if they have any questions.
Right.
I think it helps keep people honest, number one. And number two, I think it also helps provide sort of backup to what the person is saying about themselves. So, and I don't just mean backup in terms of like, hey, this is a real person, but I mean, if somebody says in their application, well, my greatest weakness is attention to detail, and the recommender is like, she's really good at attention to detail, it's going to be a little bit like, well, wait a minute, like you said in your essay this thing, but your recommender is saying something different. So what it does is it helps harmonize the application and provide backup to what you're saying. And I think another really important point finally is that since recommenders are usually senior to you, almost always,
Yeah.
they've sort of been around longer. And so they will have a more, I don't want to use the word mature, but they'll have a more seasoned outlook as to your potential, right? Everyone starts off their careers with a ton of energy and everyone thinks that they're going to become the CEO when they graduate from college. But if a recommender is like a senior vice president at your company or the head of your small nonprofit, they will have had a more measured perspective as to whether or not you really are a star.
Yeah, I think I'm really glad you brought up the point of exaggeration. I think that's something that it kind of becomes second nature to people because every business school is really competitive. I think it's just easier to write about yourself in a really good light, right? I think one of the things that I was surprised with in recommendations is you have a grid, right? So not only recommenders are supposed to write two narratives for you. Most of the schools have questions around like one essay on leadership and one essay on feedback for your recommenders. But they also have to fill out like this grid where you talk through from this candidate kind of sucks and all the way to this candidate is the best thing that I've ever seen in my whole career, right? And generally, my recommendations to folks have been like, try to find a recommender who really thinks very highly of you. If your recommender just thinks you're, one of the average folks in your company, it's just not going to reflect very well, right? Do you agree with that, or do you think recommendations would be much better if if written super clinically?
Oh, I mean, so I think, well, first of all, the criticism. So you alluded to the fact that every recommendation has 2 narratives that need to be written. So just for people who, I mean, hopefully people have already figured this out because the deadlines are like in 4 days.
Yeah.
But basically they have to write a narrative about ways in which you are essentially better than your peers. They don't phrase it that way, but they want to know what your strengths are, and then they also want to know about how you've grown, what has been a weakness for you, or what continues to be a weakness for you currently.
Right.
And so I think you need to have someone who thinks super highly of you for the first one, but who also is honest somewhat in the second one. Because if in the second essay they just say, weaknesses, Shovik has no weaknesses, everything he does is perfect, it's going to, the recommendation is not going to have as much validity, because as a reader, I'm going to think, well, this person's full of it. Like either they're lying to me, the admissions reader, or they actually don't know Shovik that well, in which case
Yeah.
this recommendation is not as valuable. Now, going back to your point about the little check marks, I hate those grids. I think those grids are stupid. I do think that a couple of schools have started doing it in a way where it's like you have to put, you're only allowed to put like top 1% or whatever, that top 5% or whatever, for like a few of them.
Right.
And you have to put middle for a few of them, because otherwise everyone is just going to select exceeds expectations, they're just going to go down the list, exceeding expectations. And so then again, it's pointless. If every candidate exceeds expectations across every dimension, what's the point of asking about these different dimensions? So I do think that you should find someone who is going to go to bat for you. But I also think that authenticity matters a lot. And I think the narrative at that point also matters more. So if somebody gets all superiors, check mark, check mark, check mark, check mark, but then I get to the narrative about what are this person's strengths, and they say, well, Shovik is always on time and his handwriting is excellent. I'm going to think, well, this person is clearly, I mean, good for you, but at the same time, I'm not going to be like, wow, this is the next CEO of Procter and Gamble. Let's accept them into our program.
Right.
So, I think the check boxes, I don't know. I think some of the schools are trying to, I think Wharton, that's why Wharton now has a thing where they give you they give you 2 separate lists of separate adjectives, and the recommender has to pick a few from each list, and it's a forced, like you can only pick a few. So they're all good words, but they just have to pick which ones resonate most with them. I think that's at least a slightly more valuable exercise. But yeah, the check marks in general are not that useful. But you might as well tell your recommender, like, yeah, give me good stuff.
Yeah, so I think moving from there, I think one of the things that I've heard candidates a lot is like the exercise of picking the right recommender for you, right? I think your generally schools recommend give us your direct supervisor. That's what we care about the most, because it's a good assumption that your direct supervisor has had the most exposure to your work, right? So that's like one thing where I've seen applicants ask a lot of questions on GMAT forums. The other one that I also hear a lot about is, like, how do you create stories? How do you build the narrative with your recommender, right? Because you want to work with your recommender, right? Your recommendation, the content of the recommendation shouldn't come as like a total surprise to you, right? So, but you also don't want to write for them, right? Like you want them to write your recommendation. So curious to know about the first one first. How do you go about selecting your recommendation? And have you had experience where folks did not use their direct supervisor but were just fine?
So I'll tackle that one first. Lots of people cannot ask their direct supervisor for a recommendation, whether it's because your direct supervisor thinks MBAs are evil or stupid or a waste of time, or whether your direct supervisor does not want to lose you, right? Good talent is really hard to find. And for example, if it's December and I'm allocating my year-end bonuses for people, and bonuses are often used indirectly, not so much in part to reward past performance, but also to motivate people to stay into the next year. And I know that you're planning on leaving in July or June because you've applied to business school, I might be a little bit less willing to give you that. Why give you a promotion? Why give you a bonus? Why give you a promotion? Why train you up? Why spend the next 3 months training you for this higher level responsibility in a promotion if I know that you're just going to leave?
Right.
So it is relatively common for people to have very valid reasons to not use their direct supervisor. In that situation, though, you need to find someone who is senior to you, who has in some way managed you, because if we reverse engineer, if you look at the questions that you're asked in the recommendation, you can use that to actually reverse engineer who a good recommender would be. So since we know that the second the second narrative question that they have to answer is, tell us about a time you gave the candidate feedback and how they responded. If you once worked with like a vice president somewhere, but you worked with them for a week and they never really, it wasn't a close enough relationship where they were like, hey, actually, Shovik, you need to do, like, if they never gave any advice to you, then that's a pretty good sign that that person is not a good fodder for a recommendation. Right. And I think in many ways, you know, one thing that I forgot to mention before about the purpose of recommendations is that they also exist to see how well you manage upwards. Because influence without authority is, in my opinion, one of the biggest predictors of success in any future career, regardless of whether you're in business or, you know, whether you're a doctor or whatever it is. You need to be able to convince people to do things, even if you don't directly manage them, which is why, for example, someone who works for you should not be a recommender ideally, because obviously that is like, well, of course they're saying nice things about her because, you know, they want to keep their job. So it has to be someone who is not beholden to you in any way. But yes, it's definitely possible. Yeah. And then what was the second? Oh, working with the recommender to set it up. My advice is, first of all, and you know, Applicant Lab helps you do this visually. You can map out what stories you're going to say about yourself in your essays. And then you can map out which stories you want your recommenders to say. And I want you to not have the exact same story in both, because then it's a wasted opportunity. Right? You get to see these extra narratives as a gift, as an opportunity for even more good stuff about you to come out. So what I would recommend is, let's say you have a leadership essay. I don't know, let's say it's a school like Kellogg that has a primary leadership essay. What you could do is you could ask your recommender to mention that leadership example as supporting evidence. That is, mention it in passing. Sort of say like, oh yeah, she did a great job with this product overhaul. And then another time that she was fantastic was when she did this. So now you've got, first of all, the recommender is backing up the fact that you actually did all the stuff you said you did in your essay. And then they're also providing extra evidence of you being a superstar. So how do you do this? First of all, you have to think carefully about which stories you want each person to say. And then what I advise is putting together a document, got a template for it in the lab, where you fill out like, okay, you're going to be asked questions like this. Here is, of course, you can write whatever you want because people don't like to be told what to do. But I'd really appreciate it if you would focus on the time I did this and specifically talk about X, Y, and Z facet of it. So if you ran a project, I don't want the recommender wasting their time with janitorial stuff, as we've talked about in other videos in the past, with low-level stuff like, well, she did a very good job making sure that the calendar invites were all sent out on people's calendars. Like, who cares, right? But if she did a very good job of convincing the client to purchase $2 million more of software, now we're talking. So tell them what you want them to talk about, which points you want them to highlight. I advise giving it to them sort of in a bullet point list, because if you give them the narrative, there's a real good chance that they might be tempted to copy and paste it. Yeah. In which case you will have essentially indirectly written your own recommendation, which I'll talk about in a second why that's bad. So I say give them bullet points. So at least you're forcing them to talk about things in their own writing, but you're trying to guide it, because in some ways the recommendation is a way to test how good are you at managing what they do. And if you give them that document and then they like write a bunch of like mediocre stuff about you, it either means they think you're mediocre, or two, you are not persuasive enough to get them to do what you asked.
Yeah, I think the couple of things that I've seen come up is like my recommender doesn't have the time, to write about these two questions for 5 different schools. So that's like one common reason I've heard that, can I write my recommendation for myself? And the second one that I've heard is, like my recommender is not a native speaker. Like 40-50% of the class is international, so it's highly possible. I think those two reasons have come up in the past. Generally, for the first one, I don't really buy it, because if you're trying to get someone who is supportive enough for you to go to business school, they should be able to carve out some time to write like this. So my recommender, one of my recommenders was BB from GMAT Club. And I got him to write like 12 recommendations in like a month. And he did not really like groan about it. He wrote all of them because he really wanted me to go to business school. Like he really wanted me to go to a really good business school that I wanted to go to.
Right.
But I'm guessing situations can be different for different people, right? Like, so what's the best way to make it super easy for your recommenders to write like 6 or 7 different recommendation letters without literally writing it for them?
Right, right. Well, so the good news is that pretty much every school, almost every school, has identical recommendation questions. There
Right.
are a couple of weird ones, outliers out there. And even then, the schools that have the outlying questions, like, I don't know, the 4 pillars of our community are X, Y, and Z and D or whatever. Like, sorry,
Right.
I started saying, I was like 4 pillars, but X, Y, Z, I ran out of letters. When have you seen this candidate exhibit one of these pillars of the community? Even the admissions officers of those schools, they realize that it's adding an extra burden. And frankly, if I were an admissions officer, I would never ask a separate question because I know it's going to turn people off and be like, oh, I'm not asking my recommender to write something else. Let me just skip this school. Anyway, even those schools have said, like, look, it's fine if you just want to submit the standard recommendation. That's why, in fact, a lot of the schools have banded together to have the common recommendation form. So even if you're applying to 10 schools, 12 schools, your recommender does not need to write 12 separate narratives. They just have to write it once, and then they can copy and paste it into all of them. The schools are fine with that. The only exception I would really think about is maybe Stanford, because Stanford has a much longer word count limit, at least last time I checked, right? So other schools, HBS has a recommended word count limit, but it's fine if the recommender goes over it because, HBS knows that they're pretty draconian with their word counts. It's like 300 words for the first essay. Stanford has like 1,000 words for the first essay. That's about 2 pages worth of writing. So if your recommender, now that doesn't mean to have your recommender write 1,000 words, because if a lot of it's empty fluff, then it's not worth it. But if they have like 5 good stories to tell about you, have them tell all 5 stories. But for the most part, most people only need to write that recommendation narrative once, and then they can simply copy and paste it into all of the schools. So I don't see that as being a huge burden. Now, in terms of like, okay, my recommender doesn't have time, that's why you start early. That's why if you're applying to business school and you're saying, hey, Harvard, take me because I'm such an amazing leader and I'm so good at managing stuff, let me into your management school. Well, why didn't you give your recommender the questions 8 months ago? Right. So like, I don't buy it either. When people are like, oh, I ran out of time. It's like, really? And so you're trying to convince me that you're really good at management, but this is a pretty simple thing to do. Like if you give your recommender the bullet points, which is the ideal, they really couldn't set aside 2 hours to write this for you in the past 6 months, 8 months, 2 months, 1 month. I mean, yeah. So, and it also says that, yeah, like you said, that they don't really support you. If they really mentor you and they value they care about you as a mentor, they're going to set aside the time. It'll happen. Now, and so right now people are thinking, well, what's the point? I mean, I could get away. They even asked me to write it myself, right? I could get away with writing it for them, or they asked me to do it. So what should I do? The problem is that people don't realize, applicants don't realize that every person has a written voice. Just like how I have a written voice, a vocal voice when I speak, right? I have little inflections, like I say, for example, I use that a lot to fill up the filler. So that is, we each have little figures of speech that we throw into the way how we speak. The same thing is true with writing. When people write, they have a voice in their writing. They don't realize it oftentimes because they don't know they're not reading 500 essays. But when you read 500 essays, you start to learn like, okay, this is, for example, one person might use a word punctual, which is not a super common word. It's and so they might say something, blah, 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 blah. The client was very punctual afterwards. And then if the recommendation says, well, she's very punctual, now I'm going to think, well, wait a minute, that's not like a super common word. And people don't realize that it is not hard to know when you have written when you have written your own recommendation. I think I heard a rumor that some of the schools are even testing out some sort of AI software. And I don't know if this is true or not, if this is just something they said like at the AGAT conference to scare us or to scare applicants. But I think I've heard a rumor that they're trying to test out some sort of software that will actually like look at your writing style and look at the recommendation writing style and try to figure out if the same person, or what's the probability that the same person wrote it.
Right. That is weird and scary, but I think that's a good exercise too. I think a lot of people do this, and I think what it says about the application is that you can get away with something like this, right? And it's also harder for admissions folks to actually differentiate between two candidates and find out that for which one the supervisor or the recommender actually had enough good things to say that was in their own voice and not have something written for them. So I think that was I'd welcome it. I'd like to see the software actually. But I think the other question that I recently got was with a lot of GMAT, GRE waivers things that are happening in schools, right? So a lot of applicants are applying to business schools without a test score, right? So do you think any part of the application, like things that you talked about already, things like essays, recommendations, resumes, do you think any part of this application is even more important if you do not have a valid GMAT GRE score, or do you think the undergrad GPA is the only indicator that would cover up for the lack of test scores?
Yeah, so I like to quip. This is going to shock you, but I have a quip for this. I like to quip that test optional doesn't mean brain optional. So if you apply with a waiver and you don't have a score, just realize that puts so much more pressure on your undergraduate record. So if you went to, say, a university, let's say in India, that is good, but not like super famous, but you have a 760, that's actually better for you than, if you are applying, for example, if you went to IIT and you were the class topper, as they say, then I, as an admissions reader, know it's such a I love that term. There are these little idiosyncrasies of Indian English that I think are so charming. So if you were the class topper at IIT, I, as an admissions reader, know that you are super smart. But if you have like a mechanical engineering degree from a university somewhere in Pune or whatever, like I've never heard of it, but so I don't know how to judge that transcript, right? Like you've got like a 7.3 GPA. Like, I don't know. Is that a hard university? Is it an easy university? Is that 7.3 amazing? Is it not amazing? But if you have a 770 or a 760 on the GMAT, now I'm like, okay, this person can run with the big dogs intellectually in terms of academic and perspicacity. So I think that most people should not use the waiver unless like their score, they just really just blew it on test day, which happens. But just realize that then the onus is on you to then prove to them, and you need to draw their attention. Like, look, I took a graduate level calculus class in undergrad and I got an A+ in it. Or look, I passed the CFA exam on my first try, or I passed these actuarial exams that are really hard. I think it makes it a little bit harder sometimes to get in, but it also makes it harder to get scholarships. Because the number one, in my opinion, the number one reasons most schools give out merit-based scholarships is they want to buy high GMAT scores. They want to bring in these higher scores to elevate their average. So if you don't have a high score, you're not helping them in that way. It makes me less. I'm like, well, what am I getting for my money if I help pay them to come to school? I'm not saying you won't get a scholarship. I'm just saying it becomes, if you have a high score, it becomes that much more probable. But so yeah, just I think if you didn't do well and everything else about your application is stellar, then go for it. But if you're applying without a test score and you also don't have, you're lackluster in other ways, I don't think
it's not going to work for you. Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. I think which kind of brings me to my last point around this general sanity checks, right? So so you have written your essays, you've clarified your goals, you've gotten your recommendation, but you have done all of this in a short period of time. What are some of the best practices of sanity checking your application? Like especially if you are writing multiple ones. I think one of the things, one of the mistakes that I checked during my sanity check when I was applying to a ton of schools 4 years ago, and I can talk about it now because I have nothing to lose anymore. But I did mention, how in essays you often write about, like from my conversation with this person, MBA class of 2022 or whatever, I did mention a person from a different school in a school's application. And it took me a while to detect it because I was so married to my essays at that point. Like my essays are perfect. Like I can't see any difference in my essays. So that was one thing that could have been fairly detrimental that I was able to fish out right before hitting submit. But so I wanted to ask you, what are some of the ways that you would recommend folks sanity check their applications?
So I think the first thing I would tell people is if you haven't yet, a couple of days before the deadline, go through and fill in the application forms themselves. Because if you wait until the last minute, you might miss the deadline if the servers crash, or if there are so many little tiny text boxes asking you random questions, and then you're like, oh my God, it's going to take me 2 hours to fill out these text boxes and I don't have anything ready to go. So first of all, do that today. And then when you're checking over it, I think the number one mistake I tend to see is people who are going so fast that they don't read the slight differences between each school's instructions. So one school might say, what is your monthly salary? Some schools might say, what is your yearly salary? Some schools might say, please include your bonus in the salary number. We want total compensation number. Some schools might say, don't include a bonus. Some schools might say, what's your base salary and the bonus? So list them, give us the total compensation, but list it out separately. So that is one that I see. I get panicked emails sometimes a week or two after each deadline where people are like, oh my God, I put this compensation, but really it was the wrong one. Also, people make little careless mistakes with the dates of employment. So in the form itself, if you say, well, okay, I had this job from April of this year till September of the following year, make sure that you actually select, if it's a drop-down box, the 4 and the 9.
Yeah.
So that's a good one. And then, like you said, like making sure, especially if you're recycling an essay, which happens, of course, all the time, make sure that you've got the right essay to the right school. Because it just shows a lack of attention to detail, and every school wants to think that they're your first choice. So if you're like, I can't wait to go to, Duke and be part of the Blue Devils, and you submit that to Fuqua or sorry, not Fuqua, if you submit that to Tuck instead of Fuqua, it's not going to be good. So at this point, I mean, if you're only a few days out from submitting, I feel like spending a ton of time for that umpteenth, the 48th review of your essay is probably not going to yield a whole lot, but really checking those little boxes and the drop downs and whatever is probably a better use of your time right now.
Yeah, I think one of the things that helped me was to just print out the entire application and just like doing it by hand, like looking at it instead of seeing it through a computer screen. It just like because I was doing it alone, and one of the advice that people often give out is like, you show it to a friend, like get this objective person to take a look at it. But I didn't have a lot of friends who knew the nuances of business schools, right? So I took a printout of my entire application and just read through the entire stuff in person, which I think was super helpful.
That's brilliant advice. Sorry.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say that's brilliant. That's really smart, because there's something about paper. I don't know, like I can't fully digitize myself. There's something about writing something on a piece of paper physically or reading it. So good idea, Shovik.
The other thing is like, most people don't have printers anymore. So that's going to be really challenging to do that. But I think one of the other things that I see people making mistakes on is like, short answer questions in your business school applications. And often applications would have short answer questions that could very easily be essays, right? I know Harvard has a lot of them, right? For every single job that you have had, I think Harvard would ask you like, what are you most proud of in this job, or things like that, which combine 4 or 5 of them and it becomes like an essay. So I would be, I think one of the things that I tell people is, exactly what you said, is the application form is going to be just as important as your resume and your essays, because that's like a common thing that everybody has to write. So it's a very easy comparison, how much you have spent, how much time you have spent on these. So that's like one other way to like shoot yourself in the foot, is to not.
Yeah, and don't copy and paste from the resume. Sometimes I see people like where it says like, describe your responsibilities, describe your greatest accomplishments. Like people just are like, boom, copy paste from the resume, copy paste from the resume. So then I read the application form first, and then I get to the resume and I'm like, oh, like what a wasted opportunity for you to provide more color and background details in the application form.
Yeah, I think for me, the litmus test is like in the application form, I generally go over like what this job what's the day to day like? Like what am I supposed to be getting paid for? While on the resume, it was more about like, look at all the cool, sexy stuff I did, like all the greatest hits, as you would say. Cool. So I think that's pretty much all I wanted to talk about in this one today. I do have one thing to ask you, Maria. I think I don't know if you remember when I was at Michigan, and I had a lot of time in my second year of school because I had a job and I just didn't really know what to do with all this extra time. We did a mock interview, which became a really popular video. So I wanted to check if you have the time to do a redo of that. So where we spend, maybe we can take one particular school, or maybe we can do like a more generic mock interview, maybe in the next couple of weeks as a follow up to this series, and just throw out, like, I can prep on some of good responses, and I can rehearse some bad responses for you to diagnose. What do you think?
I love that idea. I would love, first of all, I just love spending time with you, Shobik, in any format. So if yes, I would love to do another mock interview with you.
Cool. Everybody is watching. Stay tuned for that. So we will do that sometime in the next couple of weeks. But it was awesome. The Google Doc again is right below the video, where you can find my resume, you can find some of Maria's comments on my goals and essays. Feel free to. I will keep access to that Google Doc for the next couple of weeks, but then I will take it away because I just don't want my random stuff hanging out in a typical Google Doc that I will forget later. But we'll be back in a couple of weeks. I'll schedule that later on a mock interview. But it was so cool, Maria. Thanks so much for doing this on diagnosing a new application. And I'll see you soon.
All right. That sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.